The year is 1718. The place is a shallow inlet off the coast of North Carolina, a stretch of dark water known as Ocracoke. It is early morning. A cold, gray light is just beginning to touch the surface of the sea. And then, without warning, the world explodes. Two sloops have appeared out of the mist, moving fast, bearing down on a single vessel anchored in the channel. On the deck of that vessel, men are scrambling. Pistols are being drawn. Cutlasses are being pulled from their sheaths. There's shouting, and then there's gunfire, and then there's smoke. So much smoke, thick and black and choking, rolling across the water like a living thing. At the center of it all stands one man. He is enormous. Well over 6 feet tall, his body filling the deck like something that should not exist. His face is framed by a beard so dark, so vast, so deliberately terrifying that men who saw it said they could not look at it without feeling a cold hand close around their hearts. Into that beard he has woven slow-burning fuses, cannon fuses, and lit them. They smolder around his face in the half-dark, trailing thin coils of acrid smoke, making him look, in the words of one survivor, like the very devil himself emerged from the gates of hell. He has already been shot multiple times. He does not seem to notice. He is still fighting. His name, the name the world knows him by, is Blackbeard. But that is not the name he was born with. And the man behind that name is far more interesting, far more calculated, and in many ways far more frightening than the legend. Tonight, we go beyond the myth. We ask the question that history rarely pauses to consider. Who was this man, really? And why did he choose, deliberately, strategically, with cold intelligence, to become the most feared human being on the Atlantic Ocean? His real name was almost certainly Edward Teach. Some historical records spell it Thatch, or Thatch, or Tash. The spelling of names in the early 18th century was not a precise science, but the man himself was very real. He was born most likely in Bristol, England, sometime around 1680. Bristol was then one of the great maritime cities of the world, a city of ships, of trade, of salt and rope, and the constant smell of the sea. It was the kind of city where a boy grew up understanding that the ocean was not a backdrop to life. It was life itself. We know almost nothing of his early years. No portraits, no letters, no records of his childhood survive. What we do know is that by his early 20s, he was already a sailor. Not just any sailor, a skilled one. He sailed during Queen Anne's War, the great conflict between England and France and Spain that consumed the Atlantic world in the first decade of the 1700s. During that war, he almost certainly served as a privateer, a legally sanctioned pirate, hired by the English crown to attack enemy shipping. This is a crucial distinction that history tends to blur. Privateering was not piracy, it was war, conducted at sea with a legal document called a letter of marque that gave you permission to attack, board, and plunder enemy vessels. Edward Teach, in other words, spent his formative years being trained by the English government to do exactly what he would later do illegally. He did not discover violence, he was taught it. When Queen Anne's War ended in 1713, that letter of marque became worthless. The war was over, the privateers were dismissed, and thousands of skilled, experienced, battle-hardened sailors suddenly found themselves with no income, no prospects, and a very specific and marketable set of skills. The transition from privateer to pirate, for many of these men, was not a moral crisis. It was an economic inevitability. It was around this time the mid-1710s, that Edward Teach found his way to the Caribbean and found his way to a man named Benjamin Hornigold. Hornigold was one of the most experienced pirates operating out of Nassau in the Bahamas, which had by then become the unofficial capital of the pirate world. A lawless, raucous, sun-drenched settlement where no governor had real authority and where the black flag flew with something close to civic pride. Hornigold was shrewd, experienced, and a gifted judge of talent. He recognized in Teach something exceptional, a natural commander, a fearless fighter, and, perhaps most importantly, a man with imagination. He gave Teach a small vessel of his own to command. He gave him his first crew. He gave him his first real taste of independent power. And Teach, quietly, methodically, over the course of the next year, began to build something that would outlast him by 3 centuries. He began to build a legend. Here's the thing that separates Edward Teach from almost every other pirate of his era, and the thing that makes him genuinely remarkable as a historical figure. He understood, with the clarity of a strategist, that his most powerful weapon was not his cannons or his cutlass or even his crew. It was fear itself. Consider the economics of piracy for a moment. A pirate attack that results in a fight is a bad attack. Ships get damaged, men get killed, ammunition is wasted, cargo is sometimes destroyed. The ideal attack, the profitable attack, is one in which the target simply gives up, surrenders before a single shot is fired, hands over everything without resistance, because resistance seems not just futile but suicidal. To achieve that, you need a reputation. You need the mere sight of your ship on the horizon to drain the courage from the men you're hunting. You need them to look at you and feel something cold and ancient and irrational move through them, something beyond tactical calculation, something closer to animal terror. Edward Teach understood this, and he set about constructing that terror with the deliberate craft of a theater director. The beard came first. It was extraordinary, a dense, matted, jet black mass that covered most of his face and fell to his chest. In an era when facial hair was common, his was something else entirely. He grew it long, then twisted sections of it into tight braids and curls, tying them with ribbons. Men who encountered him wrote about it with an almost helpless fixation, as if the beard itself were alive, as if it were the first thing the eye went to and could not leave. Then came the fuses. Before battle, Teach would tuck slow-burning hemp cord, the kind used to light cannons, beneath the brim of his hat and into his beard. He would light them, and as the smoke began to rise around his face, curling and drifting in the salt air, the effect was precisely what he intended. A man wreathed in fire and smoke, emerging from the chaos of a sea battle like something summoned rather than born. His own crew called him the Devil. His enemies believed it. He dressed for the role as well. A long, dark coat, bandoliers crossed over his chest, holding multiple pistols. It was theatrical, and it was calculated, and it worked with extraordinary consistency. There are accounts of merchant crews who, upon seeing the Queen Anne's Revenge bearing down on them, simply dropped to their knees on the deck. Not to fight, not to run, to pray. The Queen Anne's Revenge itself was a statement. In late 1717, Teach and Hornigold captured a large French slaving vessel called La Concorde. Teach took her for himself, renamed her, and immediately set about transforming her. He added more cannons, eventually 40 guns in total, making her one of the most heavily armed vessels in the Atlantic. He was no longer commanding a pirate sloop. He was commanding a warship. With this ship, and the fleet he was assembling around it, Edward Teach officially adopted the name the world would remember. The newspaper reports of the time, the terrified accounts of captured sailors, the breathless gossip of port taverns, all of them refer to this figure by the same name, Blackbeard. The transformation was complete. Edward Teach, the sailor from Bristol, had ceased to exist. In his place stood something new, something constructed, something chosen, something monstrous by design. By the spring of 1718, Blackbeard was at the absolute peak of his power. He commanded a fleet of 4 vessels and a crew of several hundred men. He controlled with remarkable effectiveness a significant stretch of the American eastern seaboard. And then he did something that no pirate had done before, and few have done since. He blockaded an entire city. Charlestown, what we now call Charleston, South Carolina, was one of the most important ports in the American colonies. It was wealthy, busy, and, in the spring of 1718, completely helpless. For several days, Blackbeard and his fleet anchored at the entrance to the harbor and stopped every ship that tried to enter or leave. He took hostages from the captured vessels, wealthy colonists, merchants, one of the governor's own council members, and sent a single simple demand to the colonial government ashore. Send medicine, not gold, not silver, not the ransoms one might expect. Medicine, specifically a chest of medical supplies for his crews. Historians have speculated for centuries about why. Was it genuine humanitarian concern for his men? Was it a demonstration of power so complete that the prize was almost irrelevant? Was it a statement that he could reduce one of the richest cities in the colonies to a suppliant, and all he wanted in return was medicine? Whatever his reasons, Charlestown complied. The medicine was delivered. The hostages were released, stripped of their valuables, but otherwise unharmed. And Blackbeard sailed away. It was the height of his legend. It was also, though no one knew it yet, the beginning of his end. Shortly after Charleston, Blackbeard did something unexpected. He deliberately ran the Queen Anne's Revenge aground, abandoning her in the shallow water near the Carolina coast. He dismissed the majority of his crew, keeping only a small, loyal group around him. And he sailed to the small settlement of Bath in North Carolina, where he presented himself to the colonial governor, Charles Eden, and accepted the king's pardon. The pardon was a real offer. The English crown had extended it to any pirate who surrendered before a specific date, promising amnesty for all past crimes. Many pirates had taken it. Some genuinely meant to reform. Others used it as a rest, a reset, a chance to lie low before the next voyage. Which category Blackbeard fell into depends on who you ask. What we know is that he settled in Bath for several months, reportedly married a local woman, and by most accounts lived quietly. Governor Eden seemed not just to tolerate him, but to actively protect him. There are strong suggestions, and historians debate the extent of it, that Eden was taking a cut of whatever Blackbeard had accumulated, and had every reason to keep his famous resident comfortable and quiet. But Blackbeard was not built for quiet. By the autumn of 1718, he was back at sea. The pardon was forgotten. The black flag was flying again, and in the distant offices of the Virginia colony, a man named Alexander Spotswood was watching the reports come in, his jaw tightening, his patience exhausted. He had decided that Blackbeard had to die. Alexander Spotswood, the governor of Virginia, was not a man who did things quietly. He was ambitious, well-connected, and deeply frustrated by what he saw as the spineless tolerance of pirates throughout the Carolina colonies. He believed, correctly as it happened, that Blackbeard was operating with the quiet complicity of Governor Eden, and he decided to act unilaterally. Without official authorization from London, a significant legal overreach that would cause him problems later, Spotswood organized and funded a military expedition to destroy Blackbeard. He hired 2 small sloops, the Jane and the Ranger, and placed them under the command of a Royal Navy lieutenant named Robert Maynard. Maynard was an experienced officer, steady and methodical. He was not glamorous or theatrical. He was the opposite of everything Blackbeard had made himself into. He did not want to be feared. He wanted to be effective. On the night of November 21st, 1718, Maynard's 2 vessels slipped quietly into the channel near Ocracoke Island, where Blackbeard was anchored with a single sloop and a skeleton crew, perhaps 20 or 25 men. They waited in the darkness until first light. The battle began before dawn. Blackbeard's crew fired first, a broadside that killed or wounded several of Maynard's men and disabled the Ranger almost immediately. Maynard, undeterred, ordered most of his surviving crew below deck, making his vessel appear nearly abandoned. It was a deliberate deception, a trap. Blackbeard, seeing what appeared to be a crippled, nearly empty enemy sloop, made the decision to board. His crew threw grappling hooks. The 2 vessels ground together, and Blackbeard himself leapt across the gap with his men, expecting easy slaughter. Instead, Maynard's crew erupted from below decks, and the deck of the sloop became a killing ground. What happened next was recorded in multiple accounts, and while the details vary, the essential shape of it does not. Blackbeard fought with a ferocity that seemed to transcend the human. He was shot multiple times. He was cut multiple times. He continued fighting. He and Maynard came face to face, both men firing pistols at close range. Blackbeard's shot missed, Maynard's did not, and still he fought. It was only when his body finally physically gave out, when the accumulated damage of 5 bullet wounds and more than 20 sword cuts made it impossible for his legs to hold him, that Edward Teach fell. When it was over, Maynard's crew stood on a deck soaked with blood, catching their breath, looking at the body of the man who had terrorized the Atlantic for 2 years. Maynard did what he had been sent to do. He cut off Blackbeard's head and hung it from the bowsprit of his sloop, the long beam that extends from a ship's bow, and sailed back to Bath with it dangling over the water like a warning. It was a gesture as theatrical as anything Blackbeard himself had ever done. Whether Maynard appreciated the irony is not recorded. The legend, of course, did not die on that deck. Sailors told stories for years, decades, centuries, of Blackbeard's headless body swimming 3 times around the sloop before it sank, of treasure buried somewhere on the Carolina coast waiting to be found, of a ghost ship manned by the damned sailing still. History does not believe in ghosts, but it does understand why we make them. Blackbeard has been dead for over 300 years, and yet here we are. There's something in the story of Edward Teach that refuses to stay buried, something that keeps surfacing generation after generation in novels and films and children's costumes and the collective imagination of a world that has never met him and never will. We are drawn to him the way we are drawn to fire, with fascination and a little fear, and the uneasy recognition that both of those feelings are exactly what he intended, because that ultimately is what makes Blackbeard remarkable, not the ships he took or the men he killed, or even the brief blazing arc of his career. It is the fact that he understood something fundamental about human psychology, something that generals and politicians and performers have always understood, which is that the stories people tell about you are more powerful than anything you can actually do. He did not just commit acts of piracy. He constructed a myth. He made himself into a symbol, and symbols, unlike men, do not die on the decks of small sloops in shallow Carolina inlets. Edward Teach chose to become a monster. He chose it deliberately, with his eyes open, with a clarity that is almost unsettling when you look at it directly. He understood that in a world governed by power, the most efficient form of power is one that does not need to be exercised, one that operates in the minds of your enemies before you have even appeared on the horizon. He was not the most successful pirate by any statistical measure. Bartholomew Roberts took more ships, Henry Every seized more treasure, others built more lasting empires on the sea, but none of them made you feel like this. None of them followed you home. The sea off Ocracoke is quiet now. The channel where the battle was fought looks, on a calm day, like any other stretch of Carolina coastline. Flat water, distant trees, birds crossing a pale sky. There's nothing to mark what happened there. No monument, no plaque, no sign. There doesn't need to be. The story does that work on its own. Thank you for joining me tonight on Dead Calm History. If this story carried you somewhere, if the smoke and the salt and the sound of those Carolina waters found their way to you, then it did exactly what it was meant to do. The sea has more stories, and we will tell them all, one dark night at a time. Until next time, I wish you a calm and peaceful night.